Hello and welcome. I'm Austin Hill. Thanks for watching as IdahoReporter.com goes one-on-one with State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Luna. Let's talk about the Common Core Academic Standards Initiative. That is something that has vehement support from some, vehement opposition from others. In the midst of that, we've seen some states that opted in to the Common Core Initiative now scaling back. I think about 5 or 6 of them have said, well, let's put the brakes on this, or let's pull out a part of it and remain with another part. There's mounting opposition to this. You remain supportive of it. Why is that?
Well, I do remain supportive, but first off, Austin, to be clear, there are states that have chosen to re-look at their commitment, but no states have stopped going forward. For example, Michigan, they did push the pause button, and they went through many months of re-examining their involvement, what the Common Core is and what it is not, how they were going to assess students against that, and at the end, they decided to fully embrace and continue with their adoption of the Common Core standards and the assessment of students. I think it's interesting to know that only 4 states in the country actually have their legislature involved in the adoption of academic standards, and Idaho is one of those. So of the 45 states that adopted the Common Core standards, Idaho is one of 4 states that the legislature actually weighed in before we adopted them. The other states, that's not the case. So now you do see some state legislators saying they never had the opportunity to weigh in on the adoption of these standards, and they want to have information, they want to have their say. But as of today, no states have pulled out of the Common Core. I think you'll continue to have states have discussions like Idaho is today about their involvement. But I still remain strong and supportive, because I think when we understand what Common Core is and what it is not, that more and more people recognize that it's standards. It's not a curriculum. It's not textbooks. It's not it's not something that's being forced upon us, right? And I think a lot of the concerns people had about Common Core went away once school started, because this is the first year that all of Idaho schools are actually using these standards, and people realized that once school started, that a lot of the things they were told were going to happen as a result of Common Core never happened, right? There hasn't been this increase in the amount of data we collected. Curriculums have not been forced upon school districts. School districts are still choosing their own curriculum, their own textbooks, their own lesson plans. And when parents actually get in the classroom and see what's happening with these new core standards, they become supportive of the path that we're on.
With respect to other states, I believe Ohio is still in the pause mode.
Yeah, I don't even think they would describe it as the pause mode. I think they're continuing to move forward with implementation, but when it comes to the assessment, you have some that are trying to decide how they want to measure against these standards. But my point is, things are fluid. But my point is that no states have officially adopted it. None of the states have officially withdrawn.
But Utah officially adopted it and then abandoned the testing consortium.
Correct. Because those are 2 separate things. But Utah chose to keep the standards, but to do their own assessment, and not work with other states on developing an assessment against these standards.
You mentioned legislatures, state legislatures weighing in on this. The full legislature of Idaho never weighed in on this. This was adopted through the rules process with education committees, about 9 legislators in the House, 9 legislators in the Senate. Does the full legislature need to have a say in this? Was such a big, enormous undertaking?
Well, it's no more of an undertaking than when we adopted the standards originally back in 2002, right? We used the same process in 2002. We used the same process 5 years later. We use the same process we've always used when we've adopted standards in Idaho. And that is, that the state board has responsibilities that are identified not only in law but in the Constitution about education in Idaho, and it's through that responsibility the State Board of Education has that decisions about graduation requirements, how many credits a student should earn in math, how many credits a student should earn in English, all those things have always been decided at the state board level, including the standards and how we'll measure against those. And then they go in front of the House Education Committee and the Senate Education Committee. So we use the same process we've always used. If people think that process needs to be expanded, I don't have a problem with that conversation, but I think we need to understand what the constitutional responsibilities are of the state board, and what they are of the legislature. And it's a thing, the executive versus the legislative branch, and the proper balance there. And the checks and balance happen when the state board makes these standards decisions and graduation requirements decision, and then the legislature through the rule process approves those. That's the check and balance, and I think we want to keep that balance. But at the same time, if the legislature feels like they need to have more input or being made more aware, I'm open to that conversation. I just think it's important for people to understand that we did not sidestep the process we've used for over 10 or 12 years in adopting standards in Idaho. We use the exact same process.
You have maintained that the Common Core academic standards agenda is an Idaho agenda. In fact, there's been a very concerted effort, I think, to kind of rebrand it and call it the Idaho Core Standards Initiative. Is it really truly an Idaho Standards Initiative, or is this not on some level a nationalized effort?
Well, you could call it the fact that you have many states working together, but the fact that we're choosing to work together, I think, is important for people to understand. When I hear the word national or nationalized or definitely federal, then there's the impression that all states are doing this and they're being compelled to. And that's not the case.
And yet you have noted in the past that you saw an effort back, 2 or 3 years ago, where you believed that the Obama administration was trying to co-opt the
Sure.
Common Core initiative. And even still today, the U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, is very, very defensive about the Common Core initiative. He touched off a pretty high level of controversy, I would say, back in November, speaking, I believe, at a convention of state superintendents, where he said the only people that oppose Common Core are, quote, white suburban moms who are upset that the academic standards show that their kids are not brilliant. I mean, really, if this is not a federal agenda, a federal initiative, why would I should add that Secretary Duncan, in a sense, apologized for those racial comments, but if this is not a federally driven thing, why is he so hands-on involved?
Well, here's how I look at that. Secretary Duncan is also very supportive of charter schools. So I'm assuming that in Idaho we don't want to do away with charter schools because we have a Secretary of Education that supports charter schools. Secretary Duncan is supportive of teacher evaluations being tied to student achievement. So are we in Idaho. So I'm assuming that because Secretary Duncan supports teacher evaluations being tied to student achievement, that now all of a sudden Idaho doesn't want to do that. So we have a Secretary of Education that interestingly comes from the other party and from the liberal part of the party, but also comes from a school district, the Chicago School District, that has seen the benefit of giving parents choice in education, improving education. Tying teacher evaluations to student achievement improves student achievement. So he supports things that many of us on the conservative, many of us as conservatives have supported. And so the idea that we would have standards that are higher and clearer and fewer is something that he supports. Now, his comments about who is resisting these standards, I don't know why he said that. You'd have to ask him. But what I do know is that Idaho voluntarily chose to participate in the development of the standards. Idaho's teachers participated in that with teachers in other states. And Idaho continues to voluntarily participate. Other states have chosen not to participate. We do not receive any federal dollars because we chose to participate. We would not lose any federal dollars if we were to walk away from the Common Core standards. The fact that the Secretary supports these higher standards, I understand how that gives people some pause, but I ask him to consider the fact that he also supports charter schools. Does that mean we should no longer have charter schools in Idaho? And I don't think that's the case.
Opponents of Common Core frequently cite the state of Massachusetts as being a problematic scenario, in that the state of Massachusetts had applied to receive what were known as Race for the Top funds. That was a funding initiative from the Obama administration early on in the president's first term in 2009 and into 2010. Massachusetts applied for the funds. They had not yet adopted the Common Core initiative. They didn't fare so well when the funding awards came out. Next go around, they had adopted Common Core and they got lots of money. Opponents of Common Core would look at that and say, Common Core is a carrot and stick for the individual states. You don't adopt the initiative, you're going to miss out.
Well, Massachusetts made a number of changes to their application, and they could speak more clearly to that. But I think it's important for people to remember that originally we were told that Massachusetts are the standards that we should all be striving for. And then when those people saying that were told, well, Massachusetts adopted the Common Core, then they tried to figure out, well, there must be some reason that they did it other than the fact that Massachusetts analyzed them and decided that they were better for better standards to work towards. What I can tell you is that many states chose to adopt the Common Core standards, some did not. And many states applied for Race to the Top funds and that had adopted Common Core, and some had not. There's no quid pro quo, right? Idaho had adopted these standards, but we never received any Race to the Top funds. And most of the states that adopted Common Core standards have not received Race to the Top funds. So I understand how people tried to make these connections, but again, understand that the original contention of the people that were against the Common Core standards said that the reason Idaho and every other state adopted them is because we did receive federal dollars. Then when they found out we did not receive federal dollars, they tried to change the subject and talk about, well, then it was used as an enticement for at least one state to adopt Common Core. And it's just not the case.
Superintendent Luna, over the course of your tenure in this office, you've frequently said that education policy is not a Republican versus Democrat kind of thing. Clearly with the Common Core initiative and the support and opposition, it's not a Republican versus Democrat dividing line. You have, for example, a gentleman named Andy Cody, who's a teacher in the Oakland school district, very left-leaning, very democratic region of the country. He's a columnist for Education Week, which I think is a fairly respected education journal. He's described Common Core as a fiasco in the making. Shannon Stiles, she writes the Mom blog for Huffington Post, another very left-leaning publication. She's in the state of New York. She's a high school teacher there. She says that officials that still support Common Core aren't listening to the people that they are supposed to be serving. So you got people on the left opposing this. You got a lot of people on the right supporting Common Core. It strikes me that the juxtaposition, support versus opposition, really is kind of a dividing line between teachers and parents who have kids in the classroom and those outside of the classroom who think it's good. Teachers and parents with kids in the classroom very concerned about this and saying, how do we do this? Folks outside the classroom, Republican, Democrat alike, say this is good. Is that where the dividing line is?
No, definitely not in Idaho, and that's what I pay attention to are the people in Idaho. And you'll see in Idaho that from classroom teachers to parents to the business community to higher ed, Democrat, Republican, that there is broad support for the standards that we currently have. And I think it will continue. So, I can't speak for what's happening in California. I can't speak for what's happening in New York. I do believe that the proper implementation of the standards is going to affect people's attitude towards how the standards are being used and how effective they are. And in Idaho, this is a 5-year process that we've gone through before we're into full implementation of these standards. And because of the professional development we've provided, I think we've done a very good job of informing people and answering questions the minute the questions arise. And because of that, our support in Idaho is very broad amongst stakeholders. And I think you've seen the stakeholders come out in a very public way, whether it's the teachers union, the superintendents association, the school boards association, right? Last November, they voted at their state convention on a resolution to support the core standards, and I believe it was 80% approval to support them. So in Idaho, at least, classroom teachers, administrators, school board members, parents, PTOs, and the business community is in full support of these standards, and that's who I listen to far more than individuals from New York or California.
State Senator Janie Ward-Engelking, Democrat in the Idaho Senate, newly appointed to that position. Of course, she served in the House before that. A retired school teacher. I think she speaks with great force, great respect from education stakeholders from a broad range of areas. She's very supportive of the standards, and you're talking about the standards. She sits on the Senate Education Committee. She's saying, I'm very concerned about the testing processes. Other members of the Senate Education Committee in particular saying, The testing consortium is a problem here. How do we do this? What does this do to the students in the first year when we're really not clear what the data produces for us? Does Senator Ward Engelking and others, and Ward Engelking, by the way, Senator Ward Engelking would tell us that she's visited with teachers and district superintendents throughout the Treasure Valley. She's from Boise, but she says she's listening to people in the classroom, and the testing issue is a problem.
Yeah, I think there's some unanswered questions about the test. And I think the reason we have many unanswered questions is because we're in the middle of the phasing in of the assessment. Last year, we piloted the new assessment in about 120, a little over 120 Idaho schools. This spring, we field test this in all of our schools. And then a year later, we actually do an operational test. And we learned a lot once we did the pilot test, it answered some of the questions people had about the new assessment. But it didn't answer all the questions. Now we will do the field test in all of our schools, and it will answer more questions that we have. And so I liken it, Austin, to, before school started this year and we had actually fully implemented the new Idaho Core or Common Core standards, there was a lot of unanswered questions. But once we were actually able to start school and all schools using those standards, it answered a lot of those questions. The same thing is going to happen as we go through the process of implementing the new assessment. Once we get through the field test, a lot of the questions people currently have about how long the test actually takes, what kind of stress it puts on the technology that we have in our schools, how do students do when they're doing more than just a multiple choice test, but they're actually interacting with the technology. They're actually writing essays, in high school as part of the test. They're actually solving math problems and explaining how they got to the answer rather than just using multiple choice. Those are questions people have. We won't have the answers to after we do the field test. But just like we were able to resolve many of the issues of the core standards once school started, I think we'll answer many of those questions once the field test is completed and we learn from those results. And based on what we learn from the field test, then we'll make adjustments and make decisions based on facts and evidence before we move into the operational test a year later.
Let's talk about another concern that a lot of parents and perhaps some teachers have, but parents in particular, and that is data security.
Yeah.
And let's try to contextualize this. You don't have anything to do with the IRS or the NSA, but you and I as Americans, all of us as Americans, we live in this environment where in the post-Edward Snowden revelation era, we have the National Security Agency spying on people worldwide. Supposedly the President of the United States and the Congress don't know anything about it and have no way of reining it in. We've got the United States Senator Mike Crapo, our own Senator Mike Crapo, a ranking member of the U.S. Senate Banking and Finance Committee, saying that there is this newly created government agency called the National Financial Protection Bureau, NFPB, that operates completely autonomous from the Congress and the President and collects data on every credit card purchase we make. I think a personal friend of yours, Frank Vandersloot, revealed publicly in 2012 he was being audited by the IRS for the first time in 2012, ostensibly because he supported the wrong presidential candidate. I think he's been vindicated. Some people say, well, that's just crazy, that would never happen. We've seen clear cases of that. Even as we sit here today, there's news out that it may very well have been the case that back in 2011 and 2012, the IRS was working with the Department of the Treasury, figuring out how to target conservative religious Jewish groups and religious Christian groups and Tea Party groups for audits and basically harassment from the IRS. All things having nothing to do with public education, I get it. But we live in this environment where people are hypersensitive to their data security. And then here comes the Common Core academic standards agenda. And in Idaho, we've got the data collection system that has a very sophisticated name to it that most people don't really understand, I don't think. But we're told, don't worry, your data will be secure. Is it understandable to you why people would have concerns?
Everything you said I agree with, except the very last phrase where you said, don't worry, because I don't think anybody should not worry about data security, and it's a concern of mine, right? I think what people do need to understand when it comes to education is that we're not collecting any more data points on children or any different kind of data points on children today than we were before we adopted the core standards. And in many cases, we're collecting less personal data on children than when you and I went to school. For example, they collected Social Security numbers when I went to school, and I suspect when you went to school. That's not the case today, right? But what is different today versus what we went to school is what was collected on us was put in a paper file, right? And that file would follow us from school to school. And where that paper file is today, I have no idea. But what happens today is there's no longer these paper files, there's electronic files. And people are concerned, and rightfully so, about how secure those electronic files are. I am convinced that what we currently are doing is adequately protecting those files, but I think it's important going forward that we have the laws and the rules and the statutes in place to ensure that that data remains secure.
But all of what I was just describing with the IRS and the NSA, certainly with the IRS, that's all outside the confines of law. I mean, these things can be abused.
They can be abused, and so what we have to do is make sure that the data we're collecting is transparent, meaning that parents know exactly every data point that's being collected on their child. So you can go to the school and say, let me see every piece of data you have on my child.
But does that, even if parents can see what's being collected, does that preclude the fact that that data can be misused?
No, but I think it's important to first, as a state and as an agency, that parents know every piece of data that is being collected, and then we have to make the argument that that serves an educational purpose, because if it doesn't, then we shouldn't be collecting it. Once we determine that it does meet an educational purpose, then do we have the laws and the processes and the security in place to make sure that that remains secure. Senator Getty has introduced a bill that is very clear and has some teeth in it as to what happens when people abuse the use of the data that is collected. And I think I support that bill. I sent a letter to Governor Otter and the chairs of the House and Education committees last fall, telling them that this had to be done either through executive order or through a piece of legislation. And so you see that legislation. I do think it's important that we have educational information on children, because we need to be able to individualize education. But I think whatever we collect, we have to be transparent in what we collect. It has to meet an educational purpose, and then we have to demonstrate that we have the policies and the processes in place to keep it secure, and that there are severe consequences if those laws are violated. And I think the bill that Senator Getty has put forward is, with a $50,000, I believe it's a $50,000 fine for abusing the data that's collected, and also it assures that no data at the student level leaves the state. Right? I think those are important steps.
None of that data gets reported to the U.S. Department of Education?
Only in the aggregate, not on the individual student level. Let me make one exception. We have a category of students that are referred to as migrant students. They attend schools in multiple states a year. That information is in a data bank that other states have access to, so that when the student goes from Idaho to California to Arizona, to Colorado, and follows the seasons, that information is put in a clearinghouse outside of Idaho that other states have access to. That's the only information that is attached to an individual student that leaves the state. When it comes to the U.S. Department of Education, none of the data we have on individual children leaves the state unless it's in the aggregate. In other words, it's rolled up into classrooms or multiple classrooms of students or categories of students, and then it's reported, and it's not reported in a way that can be identified down to the individual student.
Despite the safeguards put in place, you would acknowledge then, if I hear you correctly, that these things can be abused. Let's imagine the next superintendent after you or the next one after that doesn't have the moral scruples that you bring to bear, or a different legislature or other staff at the State Department of Education.
Well, I think that's
risk.
Yeah, I think that's no doubt. I mean, if I shop at Target,
We know what happened at Target.
What I'm saying, I file my taxes online. I mean, I understand the risk that we take, in the digital world that we live in. That's why I think it was important that we have laws in place with teeth in those laws, because then when you have a new state superintendent or even a new legislature, the law still remains. And that law would have to be repealed or weakened in a very public way in order for us to remove some of the barriers to data security. And so, so I think that's why it's important that we put this in law. And I think the world that we live in today, that it is an information world, and more of what we do is digital. And so I think we have to adapt to that, and that's what we're working towards doing, is not only adapting to it, but making sure that personal information that is collected on individual students is secure and remains secure.